We are taking you behind the scenes of the National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence.
With unprecedented access to the scientists pushing boundaries and shaping our future, this show will take you to the cutting edge and beyond.
And whether you're an expert yourself or just science curious, this is the show for you.
Welcome to the Turing podcast.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Turing podcast. Today we're joined by David Bevan, who is a senior research software engineer, and Dr. Kasra Hosseini, who is a research data scientist, both of whom work in the Alan Turing Institute's research engineering group. We're going to be talking to them about one of the Turing's major research projects in the digital humanities, known as Living with Machines, which has taken a fresh look at the history of the Industrial Revolution with data-driven approaches. Dave and Kasra, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you.
So Dave, I'm going to jump in with the first question. Can you tell us a bit, before we go into the Living with Machines project itself, a bit about digital humanities as a field? Is this a relatively new discipline?
It's not. I think the digital humanities tends to trace its roots back to, I think, the 1960s, and Father Buser worked with IBM. So Father Buser was very interested in understanding religious writings, and I can't quite, edit point. And he worked with IBM to take the text of the religious writings and put it into a concordance program so he could see where various things were mentioned and in what context they were. So there's a long tradition of sort of putting texts into the machine and being able to ask questions. So digital humanities as a term probably was coined, let's say, in the 2000s, but prior to that it was humanities computing for the humanities, things like that. So there's a long tradition of people being able to look at their discipline in a reproducible way, using data and really sort of those methods that you look at things at a larger scale than an individual could in the back of a library with a handful of books.
I had a question. So do you think the term digital humanities is a bit scary for people in humanities? Because there's sometimes that separation between humanities and more computational groups.
I'll accept it can be, but I really don't want it to be. And some of that, I wonder whether that's just generations of scholars being taught by, generations of scholars that have happened in the past at university. And sort of it takes a while for some of these digital techniques to become mainstream. I do not think digital methods can help you answer all the questions in the humanities, and there absolutely is a role for the lone scholar. There is a role for individual perspectives, but there is also a great opportunity to ask new questions. So I think what digital humanities does, it's not taking away from the humanities, it's actually adding to it, and it's forming new collaborations like Living with Machines, where we've got historians, linguists, curators, geospatial experts, demographers, all coming together with different perspectives. So the digital gives us a way of talking to each other in a way that perhaps some of the traditional disciplines that are quite well defined don't.
Yes, and I'm imagining as well that a lot of people in the humanities, although they have their own ways of doing research, whether they're a historian or someone researching art or literature, it's probably quite different from the kind of research practices we're more familiar with in, I don't know, I guess if we're being mean, we'd call it the hard sciences, but but not to suggest that the humanities is any less rigorous in their research practices.
And it's not. And I think we need to think of, quite often we hear the word science when actually I think people mean research. And in the UK, people are quite sensitive to it. I think on the continent, science can mean research a little bit more fluidly. But maybe Kasra's got some good thoughts on this one too.
My background is in science and geophysics. Um, and I joined the Living with Machines in 2019. And since then, I guess we don't really have a clear answer to what digital humanities is. But at the end, it's really using digital methods, digital techniques. This can be visualization, data science, machine learning, or any other methods, and apply that to humanities fields. Which I totally agree with what Dave said, that these methods actually open new avenues, new ways to understand those data sets. But I mean, comparing it with like geophysics, I guess it's as rigorous as those fields in terms of research.
Nice. That's good to hear. Well, on that note, can you tell us a bit now about the Living with Machines projects that you mentioned, Dave, at the Turing? What are the goals of this project? What are you hoping to achieve, and how sort of big and all-encompassing is it? Because it is one of the Turing's big projects.
Oh, it's a biggie, and it's a 5-year project. I counted, I was doing slides the other day, and there are 28 amazing people, past and present, involved in this from, lots of different disciplines. And that's something we really proud ourselves on. And Ruth Ann at the PI is really, really keen to make sure people understand that the project is this sort of radical collaboration, as she puts it. So we're still learning how we make the most out of our interdisciplinary collaboration and how we work together. And those exciting touch points where between the bits of sort of established knowledge, we find new opportunities. So we're very proud to be Arts and Humanities Research Council funded. It was one of the Strategic Priority Fund projects. And certainly in terms of humanities funding, it's a big one. And we started in 2019, and there are 6 institutions, but certainly run by the Turing. And there are, as I said, there's everything from research software engineers to data scientists, curators, computational linguists, historians, geographers. And, we're there to look at the Industrial Revolution, which has been well studied, but there are lots of nuances that we can begin to get into and ask new questions. And I'll happily sort of talk you through some of those later. But to set the scene, we are looking at the years 1780 to the 1920s. And a lot happened, certainly in Britain, as it industrialized at that point in time. And we're there to sort of look at that, to see how the country and the people in it really changed.
So what is important or relevant about that time frame that you mentioned? Why study that period of history instead of just last century before? Yeah,
that is the period where the country underwent industrialization. So
yeah.
Towns and cities formed in a way and the schools began to focus on them. Transport opened up. So one of the amazing pieces of work that Kazra is doing is looking at how the land and how the sort of space in the country changed due to the arrival of the railway. How that was positive in terms of people traveling about, but also negative in terms of the way it carved its way through established parts of town. And we can see that even where the Alan Turing Institute is based in the British Library, the area around that and the arrival of the railway there really went through bits of London and divided communities. So a lot of change was happening. People were more connected. Language was changing rapidly. Newspapers were taking off. So news was traveling rapidly. Just everything, just society just went up a notch. And, we can think of it as being, it's often sold as a very, very positive thing, but it wasn't always. People in rural communities lost their jobs. The factory turned people into workers, and they had to, watch the time all the time. And a lot of change sort of happened to synchronize the country, and we lost a lot too. So we're sort of looking at some of the nuances there. Kazra, you'll want to add plenty of stuff because I think we see different parts of the project. So Kazra and I are really good to discuss this with you because we're at sort of different ends of bookmarking the project?
Well, I guess you summarized the main points very nicely. I mean, I'm happy to answer any specific questions about any of these strands of work, but yeah, but basically, maybe one thing that I can add is in the Living with Machines project, one of the main components are the data sets that we're working with, and these data sets, to answer some of the questions that Dave talked about. And those data sets, they range from newspapers, census, and also maps, map sheets that they were surveyed and published different period of time. And one part of the Living with Machines project is to analyze these methods, for example, for the text, for the newspaper, using natural language processing and computational linguist methods. And on the other hand, for the maps, using computer vision techniques to extract information from them, and in a way probe those transitions, those changes that Dave talked about.
Where do these where do these data sets come from? The maps and the text that you mentioned.
So we're very, very fortunate to be working with the British Library and their partners, Find My Past, to have access to the British newspaper archive. And for our time period, where we've got sort of roughly speaking 25 plus terabytes of historic newspapers that we have access to. It's in, and that's not the images. So there are the beautiful images of the pages. This is the kind of markup, the layout, if you like, the pagination and the textual content we have access to. And we've just sort of finished a major stage of marshalling and getting ready that data. And we haven't actually added it up yet, but my best estimates are like this. I think in there, we are going to have something like 145 million articles and about 118 billion words worth of content. And to put that into perspective, if you assume a novel is 100,000 words, that's over 1 million novels. And you would have to read something like 32 novels a day for 100 years to get through the content. Yeah. And we're asking the computer to do that in less than 100 years and to remember what it read on day one. So
that would just be a very busy weekend.
It could be a busy weekend. Yeah, and it is a very busy time for the computers as well.
Not all of us have these stellar reading skills.
But it's not just that. So that's the text, and in many respects, it's got some challenges around the OCR, which I could dig into. But actually connecting, one of the central tenets to the project is kind of connecting place. So if you can identify a place in the text, can we also understand it from the census or those beautiful Ordnance Survey maps, Kazra, that we're getting from the National Library of Scotland? Tell us about them, because they are stunning.
Yeah, for the maps, there are actually different entities that they digitized maps. So British Library has done some digitizations, but for one of our works that we're working on now, we are using the maps digitized by the National Library of Scotland, NLS. And it's amazing. So basically, you can also access these maps via their web page, and you can download the maps very easily and work with them. Very high resolution maps, actually. And the maps that we're working on now, they are 6 inch to a mile, and they basically cover the whole England, Wales, and Scotland. They were surveyed and published at different times, like towards the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century. And we are basically trying to extract information from those, but we have access to these data sets at different scales and different editions of the maps.
Yeah, sounds like the Living with Machines project as a whole has access to quite a wide variety of like different interesting historical sources of data. I'm just like wondering, thinking still about the big picture, and then we'll ask a bit more about what you guys are working on specifically. So what are the sorts of questions about the 19th century that we're hoping to answer with this kind of big historical data, if you will, whether it's the newspapers or the maps or whatever else, that a historian using like traditional research methods on their own, who obviously can't spend hundreds of years reading through all those newspapers, what kind of questions can we try to answer that historian wouldn't be able to answer on his or herself?
I think first of all, I'll sort of, it's worth pointing out that newspapers aren't the independent source of all information. No, they are just a very, very convenient data-wise.
They are 100% factual though in their claims, that I believe.
They are just
They
like
wouldn't
Fox
lie.
News.
Yeah.
No, certainly not. They do not have political leanings, and we can get into that later. I think one of the benefits of doing these things at scale is that we, quite often a historian might perform a number of case studies on particular places that might be really good exemplars for the wider scene, or they may be extremes. We can begin to look at the nuances across everywhere, because we can sort of, if our digital methods are akin to the traditional scholarship, then we can begin to roll that out at scale. And I think that gives us an advantage, because we are looking in places that may not be the obvious places. So the kinds of things we're looking at begin to understand, the flow of trade and goods between parts of the UK and how that influenced the growth of cities. For example, Sheffield is known for its steel industry. How place and the demographics of place and the people there have changed, as I said, as industry comes, good and bad. We're looking at some of the nuances of language, how different classes, if you like, of people, but certainly different individuals in different places and across time, how they think of mechanization, and really specific bits. So we want to answer the question: what is industrialization? What is a machine? And if you ask our newspapers, 9 times out of 10, a machine is a sewing machine. But we know there are so many adverts for sewing machines out there. But we can begin to question some of the contemporary autobiographies that were written by mainly men, frankly. But we can begin to critique that and see how representative they are of the whole picture. So it's really sort of quite broad in a sense, but we're trying to get everywhere. And I think as we begin to develop our knowledge of the sources, we can begin to ask really nuanced questions as we hop from our different data sources. So can we identify place in a map? Can we understand the sorts of people that were living there from the census? Can we understand from the newspapers the conflicting views of mechanization there? The factory owners think this is great. We can produce things at a greater profit and we can move them across the country easier. But the individuals are having to move home, move to the city, live in poorer conditions sometimes, and have their life controlled by the factory clock. So we can begin to look at the same event through the lens of different people and different perspectives. And I think that plural nature to our history, the fact that there is no one truth, there are different perspectives, is so important. And this is something that data science and AI, can really stop and listen to us as we sort of show how something can be described so many different ways. That's so important to me, at least.
You're meaning to say that there's more than, men that did things in the past.
There may well have been strong women in the past too.
Who knows? Yeah. So besides this, wonderful discovery, this is a question for both of you. What is it that you found the most interesting that you found out by doing this work of living with machines? I think I blue screened our guests.
Oh, wow. I'm going to let Kaz go first, mainly because I'm still thinking.
Well, okay, it's a difficult question. I mean, as Dave said, it's a big project. There are like 25 people involved. And there are also different types of projects, types of findings in living machines. But for me, if I have to pick one, I guess I will go with our animacy paper, which is somehow related to what also Dave was talking about. And I picked this because there are like 10 authors on the paper with very different backgrounds. So it's very, very close to how we work in the Living Machines project. So we have computational linguists, data scientists, software engineers, curators, historians on that paper. And that paper, I mean, the actual title is Living Machines, a study of atypical animacy, if I'm not mistaken. And the idea of that paper is to basically propose a new method to determine if an entity was represented as animate or not. And so to just clarify this, this is actually one example from the paper that, well, I don't know if I can remember it exactly actually, but it's, they were told that the blank stopped working. And the exercise that we did in the paper was to fill this blank, to basically complete this sentence. And what we noticed in that paper was that if we use the language model, which is basically tells us how to complete this sentence, if we use a language model that was trained on text before 1850, the words would be more around the man, slaves, prisoners, and etc. But as we go towards the end of 19th century, the language model would complete that sentence using machines, for example, or engine to start working. So basically, it's how to detect how people started to talk about objects and if they are represented those in text as animate or not. And I guess that was an interesting piece of work. And we have not applied it to all the newspaper articles, but that's what we're working on now. In that paper, we developed this new method to look at this.
It's really interesting that you're using this language model to complete a sentence to then almost like find out what was the commonly used phrase in the data that the model was trained on in the first place. But then it sort of seems like a roundabout way of doing that, but then I can't think how else I would do that. So like other than just searching for keywords, but then I guess this sort of grounds it in the structuring of the sentence itself or something like that. And maybe that allows you to pick out those words that are specifically I don't know, does it allow it to like contextualize what your findings more, perhaps?
So I guess what is interesting about language models is that you can use it to discover new things in the text. Mm-hmm. So the things that you were not thinking about beforehand. So if we do pattern matching, you start with some words, let's say start with engine, machine, and etc. And as you said, we go through the text and search for those. But with language model, we can start to find some of those, let's say, hidden words, or some words that we are not hidden words, but some of the words that we are not thinking about them when doing pattern matching, and try to extract those information. For example, what language model allows us to do is to say, what are the most similar words to machine in this data set? And some of those words we didn't even know about or didn't think about those words. And I guess that's one of the main advantages of using such methods compared to pattern matching, for example.
Well, it's interesting that the example you gave there in that the sentences that were later on in the models trained on the later on data were filling in with machine. The early ones were not. You might have expected it to fill it in with man, but then you also found that it was filling it in with prisoner, which I don't know, maybe is a bit like, I was like, okay, so the prisoners were being used for labor. The machines. I mean, not that shocking, but I guess it's a little bit unexpected, I guess, depending on how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why it's interesting to use such kind of methods. Is that in a way it's like AI assisted research. Mm-hmm. So we see such kind of words like prisoner, and you're wondering, does it even make sense? And you can go then and do your pattern matching and etc. to see where in the text they were talking about that. And maybe it was a mistake from the model. Maybe we just don't have enough data, or maybe our model is not robust to predict those specific words. But it gives us an opportunity to look at those and do close reading. So basically combining the data science machine learning methods with the humanities expertise or historian expertise.
And could you argue that it helps remove some of the individual bias? So if you had to list the dictionary words that you were looking for, what you've just described seems to supplement that with something that's true to the actual data that you're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. But if your data set is biased, then your model is also so it removes some of the biases, like I guess the individual biases, but still you need some additional steps to remove the biases in the data set itself. Because our language models, they are trained on, for example, if you train a language model that only talks about men, because we talk about this, then we would not even have some specific words in this model. So we cannot remove the bias of the data set using language model, but maybe we can detect those.
And our newspaper data set is biased. It is so skewed in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I guess if you train the model on, I don't know, like Farmers Weekly versus if you train it on like the Telegraph. I don't know if Farmers Weekly is a real thing, but you get my point. You're going to get very different answers coming out to those, what the language model suggests, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
And our language changes over time as well. So, Barbara McGilvery is our expert on that semantic change, on how words shift focus. And, the Victorians loved a report of an accident. They liked a bit of gore. And more often than not, you find all these melancholy accidents. And I'm not sure that's a phrase we would use in today's reporting. I know what they're getting at. They mean a sad, a tragic accident,
Right.
but melancholy is the word that tends to get used. So if you didn't know that, and you didn't use the kind of model that Kazra is talking about, you might miss these occurrences. So it's an important sort of checkpoint.
I think that's also a big thing about that science doesn't have. Science tends to be more inside boxes, while language and all of these things have nuances and tones of voice, even though newspaper, it's not in tone of voice, but you know what I mean. Like you're going to have a piece that is going to be upset, raging against something, is going to have a very different tone than the piece pro that thing, even though they are talking about the same topic, right? So do you find that the methods that you use capture these little differences?
I'm not sure if we've actually looked at that sort of thing, have we, Kazra?
No, we only. So what we did was only focusing on the time as the paper that we just talked about. In that, we first trained a model on the whole data set, and then fine-tuned or further tuned that model on different periods of time. And then we started to compare it with that main, or let's say, big language model that we trained in the beginning. And those were the changes that we saw from men and prisoners to machines and engine. But we have not looked at all those details that you said, no.
Yeah, well, the thing that Bea was just saying, what it makes me think of is that whatever it is you're sort of looking at in the research is still, because you're analyzing something that is very human in terms of like language when it comes to these newspapers. Your interpretation of it is still very much based on you as a person. As you were just saying, Dave, with the word melancholy, it sort of probably doesn't have quite the same meaning for us as it did for them back then. I was actually just thinking when you were saying that the fact that they were using that word to describe accidents that seem really tragic to us probably reflects that they might have happened a lot more frequently than they do now. And then like now we're like, wow, if someone, dies in a car crash, then like, that's an absolute tragedy, but if someone got killed by some, run down by a horse and cart back in the day, or even by, any kind of death just in by physical means as opposed to disease or something, it would have been a lot more common, I guess. So it's a melancholy incident.
You're quite right. It's all about context. But everything is, I think a lot of data that we capture outside of the humanities is about context too. And it's just, one thing that I ask people to do is sort of stop and pause and do you know your data? So, I've seen wonderful studies that might be based upon, I don't know, let's take TfL, for example, Transport for London. It can make available data sets that show not just where people start and finish their journey, but their route through the tube network. And that's done by them collecting your phone as it tries to connect to the various Wi-Fi hotspots as you travel. And on the face of it, that data set is brilliant. It will let you understand how somebody goes from one tube station to another. But you need to stop and say, okay, well, does everybody carry a phone? Does everybody carry a Wi-Fi enabled phone? And then you begin to understand that, your data set isn't representative. You're missing, let's say, the elderly and the very young. And maybe they're the ones that actually you need to spend more attention on because they have special needs or additional needs. So, yeah, what I like about humanities things is you can explain that in the data. You can say, okay, the people have got different perspectives. You will see political viewpoint in today's press. It's no different. We just need to be very aware of the context in which these things were written and the audience in which they were sort of meant to attract.
Nice. So I think you've mentioned one of the bits of research, Kasra, there that you've been working on, which I think, did you call it the paper? Did you call it about animate objects?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I guess that just means I don't know. Yeah, how do you define the word animate objects? I guess something that has moving parts, like a machine.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And it was actually one of the challenges in the beginning of this project, that how do we even define animacy? The way that we're doing it in this paper is more close to human. So if it's, if, for example, in that sentence that I said, if we can't complete the sentence using, let's say, human-related words, then we would say that's an animate word. So machine is in the place of an animate object. So we redefine basically the animacy in that way. But I guess there were lots of discussions among our historians and linguists on how to define even animacy.
I think this is, discussions of the definitions of word is something that we're no strangers to in the world of data science and computing either. You take a phrase like artificial intelligence and, what does that mean exactly? There could be lots of definitions. We're going to be recording a podcast on that exact topic with one of our colleagues soon, so stay tuned, podcast listeners. But what I was going to ask Kasra and Dave was, in addition to the animacy work, what are some of the other things that you guys have been working on as members of the research engineering group, as the data scientists and software engineers who are interacting with the historians and other researchers in living with machines?
So I would say our role as research engineers in the Living Machines project, it has different flavors. So one of them, like the animacy paper or the computer vision work, is about designing the algorithms, designing the methods, and apply them to the data set. And the other part is about working on the infrastructure. And Dave is actually leading that part. So Dave, if you want to say a few words about that.
Yeah, I'm very happy to. I'll also stress, We are involved. There's not a sort of subservient relationship at all going on here, as there can be.
You're not
In
being
sort of
told what to do by bossy history professors, no, or
mm,
librarians.
no. I mean, well, yes, but then we fight back and we tell them what we can do
Yeah,
with the computer.
tell them how it is, yeah.
But it's actually really exciting because people can have bright ideas and from a technical point of view we can look at it and say, nah, that's never going to work. But have you considered doing this with it? And then that sort of eggs on the research in the sort of more humanities disciplines and be like, oh yeah, okay, we can do something with that. And I think that's that kind of game of ping pong and always egging the other party on. It's very time consuming, but it's so engaging. And I think that's one of the happiest bits. When I see that happen in the project, I know it's consumed a lot of energy, but it's amazing. It's heartwarming to see that kind of collaboration. And that's what makes us do what we do. So yeah, you've had me rant on about this sort of idea of representativeness and bias. And I think knowing your data is so fundamental to this project that's where a lot of my initial time and effort, along with Caspar von Bielen, has been in sort of doing this environmental scan, if you like. So there's the digital data that we have access to from the newspapers. That is only a couple of percent of all of the newspapers that the British Library hold, and then even wider, where all the newspapers that were ever published. So we ought to understand, if not computationally balance out the biases that are inherent in there. And some of it is due to the way that the newspapers were selected for digitization. And that can have all sorts of knock-on effects in terms of curatorial processes. So the kind of radical press, the more working class press, was physically printed on cheaper paper. Cheaper newspaper. It's sold at a cheaper price point than the more elite in society. So it hasn't preserved as well, and it's degraded. And that means it hasn't always been a good candidate for some of the physical and mechanical processes of mass digitization, where a machine is flipping pages and imaging them, and then we read them. So we're already out of balance there. We don't have digital facsimile of all of those nuanced bits. And a lot of the early work has been, and is still continuing, to look at how representative the sample we've got is of the whole, and being able to expand that to things like price point as a kind of proxy for social class, geography, political viewpoint. So there's these wonderful things called Mitchell's Press Directories, which were designed to help you've got a product that you want to advertise. You want to put your advert in the newspaper. Let's hope it's not a sewing machine this time, because there's loads of sewing machine adverts. You want to select your newspaper. So they all kind of like, there's this little handbook published every year that says, this particular newspaper covers this area, costs this amount, and has this kind of political leaning. So you can target your advert to the right demography. So we're taking that information and joining it together with what we know about the whole newspaper scene, so we can begin to understand what we have of the different political leanings and things like that, and the coverage across the UK. And that's so important, because anything that we base, the work that Kazra was talking about on the language, we need to understand that source data and where it represents, overrepresents, underrepresents particular intersectional parts of society. And if we don't do that, then we will be able to make conclusions, but they won't really stand up.
It's also, to be fair, it's still going to be only whoever was writing a newspaper at the time, I guess. Which is
quite right.
Most people won't have been. I mean, I suppose I don't know at what point we got to 99% plus literate in the country, but presumably at some point in the 19th century, that wasn't the case. Right.
I've got a funny feeling literacy rates are surprisingly high, but I mean that not not a research software engineer question, Ed. I'll have to defer to
So,
my
yes,
radically collaborative colleagues for a definitive answer on that.
Well, in any case, even if people were literate and had some education in reading, I can imagine that obviously a lot of people won't have been reading newspapers or writing newspapers, and there would have been a lot of people in society who would have been certainly not represented in the kind of things that were written in newspapers. But I was going to ask a sort of related question there, which is you mentioned that one of the sort of limiting factors could be, what of the newspaper collection actually gets scanned and what is possible to scan. But so this newspaper collection is, because this project is in collaboration with the British Library, the British Library has actually done a good job over the years of collecting newspapers and books and magazines and other things. And when I did a tour of the library, they told me that they have like everything that's published in the UK. I don't know how far back this goes, but they have like at least one copy of every book, every newspaper, every magazine. And the guy who was showing me around would emphasize, and they have every kind of magazine you can think of, at least one copy. But yeah, so it's interesting that that aspect of it may not have been a limiting factor, in that the library has actually done a really good job of like collecting all these newspapers. It's just that some of them would have been on like very cheap paper and degraded to the point where we can't scan them and digitize them.
Yeah, the British Library is an amazing institution, and what you've just described is called legal deposit. And it even nowadays covers UK web pages, for instance.
Right.
So it is their duty, and I can't remember, there's maybe 3 or 4 legal deposit libraries in the UK. Maybe each nation has one. But yes, there's a difference between holding it and it even being accessible in person. So the British Newspaper Archive is accessible on site in London and through the web if you want to subscribe, and that typically costs money. So it's not as democratized as it first sounds, and we're very fortunate to be working with the British Newspaper Archive and the British Library, but actually that does make some of our research harder to reproduce. So if you're listening at home and you're thinking, I want to get into this, I've got a 25 terabyte hard disk drive under my sofa, let's go for it. It's a little bit harder for you to do. You can't just download it. So, one thing that I would like our outputs to be is as well described as possible. So if people can access it, they can kind of add on our enhancements, but also work to the point where we can create maybe more aggregated outputs that don't give away the exact content, but like the language model Kazra was describing, can we put forward what we might call n-grams in computational linguistics? So just either word counts, the number of, it can be very simple as the word frequencies, the number of times a word occurs in a year. Can we publish that? Then can we publish, pairs of words and threes and things? And the n is up to whatever number you would like. So there must be a point, hopefully, where we can begin to get some of that data circulating a bit more publicly in the research environment. But we will work with them. They've got their commercial interests to protect.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, let me ask you sort of a final question then. Like, what's the future of the Living with Machines project? What are you guys still doing on in the project yourselves? And where is this all going? Like, where's the future of this kind of digital humanities research and living with machines in particular?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think our future is to embed the humanities in data science and AI as much as possible. So that means making people pause, not just about the ethics of things, but about those different perspectives, what it means to have missing data and things like that. And that connects with, important topics already existing but the humanities have got more to add there. So I think, our future is to kind of embed and extend. And in terms of big projects, I think some have argued living with the machines is a moonshot, and they don't come along all the time. And we've got plenty of wonderful spin-off ideas that we can't possibly tell you until we get funded. But we've got great ideas. We're here to stay as a group of people, and the Turing has been amazing in giving us space to develop this project and to encourage more humanities. It is a strategic priority, and I'm glad we've been able to do that. But also, we need to work with our colleagues in digital humanities and humanities to make sure that others can reproduce research at the level that we have. So we're so fortunate to be at the Turing, to have access to high performance computing, to skilled people, to curators that understand the nuances of the data. Regular scholars don't necessarily have that. So what does the UK, what do funders need to do to make access to that much easier so researchers that have bright ideas can go off and do it? That's what I want to see.
Nice. Actually, maybe I'll ask one more sort of follow-up from that, which is that maybe because you described it as a sort of moonshot project at the moment, and it's kind of early days in this kind of field of research, maybe it's too early to ask this kind of question, but what are the kind of things that you would like this research into the Industrial Revolution to inform about how we think about the world today that we might have not really thought about so much before doing this kind of big data digital humanities research?
Bringing back sewing machines.
Putting out more sewing machine ads, yeah.
The old school cookies.
I think it's consequences, right? So, what we're seeing so many troubles in the world to do with the environment, to do with humanity's desperate need for technology, for travel, you name it. I think actually we have the opportunity with the quantity of data that we've got that you could sort of basically take a time machine. You can type in where you were born, where you live, the things that you're interested in. And we could find somebody with a profile like that in the newspapers. And can we find them in the census? And then can we show you what your 100-year ago, 150-year ago self could have been doing? And what happened to the world around you? And would that make you think twice about what you do now and the world that we'll all inhabit in 100 years' time? So I think it's that sort of cautionary lesson. I like that. I like that idea. Maybe that's a spin-off. I don't know. I'm making it up as I'm going along.
A cautionary lesson sounds like a good thing to come out of research, I think.
I have to say that thought is terrifying. I think myself 100 years ago would not be happy. I'm not allowed to read as much.
Yeah, I don't think many of us would like to live 100 years ago compared to now, if we're honest. Kazra, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, I guess to add to what Dave said, which is quite interesting to look at it at the individual level. But from my side, I would like to see how the mass of people, like more than one, but like at the level of community, at the level of village, or even like a small part of a city, they reacted to the Industrial Revolution. And whether we can generalize some of those concepts to the modern days. And I guess that would be also quite interesting for me, that I particularly if we combine these. So what Dave said at the individual level, to probe that person, what you would do 100 years ago, and combine it with like the larger populations or mass of people.
Because let's face it, we do have an AI revolution coming. And what is that going to mean? Good point. I like that.
On that bombshell.
All the science fiction starting.
Listen, when it comes to sci-fi versions of AI, I don't think anyone's come up with the idea of this AI tells you what your life would be like if you lived 100 years ago, which is quite a nice storytelling AI robot, quite a fun film, I think. not very action packed, but all right. Well, Dave and Kazra, on that note, thanks very much for coming on the Turing podcast. It's been lovely having you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
before we go, can you tell the listeners how and where they can find you and contact you if they want to know how they were 100 years ago?
And where can they find Living with Machines and more information about it online?
Yes, if you really, really like your Victorian sewing machine adverts or anything else that you've heard so far today, trot along to www.livingwithmachines.ac.uk, and there you will find links to our wonderful blog, which sort of breaks down some of the things we've been talking about, and also follow us on Twitter. You'll find the link there, but it's Living Were Machines, because Living with Machines is a bit too long for the Twitter cyborg.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. The Turing podcast is produced by Dan Whitfield for the Alan Turing Institute. The show is hosted by me, B. Costa Gomes, Ed Kalstri, Joe Dungate, Christina Last, and Anika York. Music for this podcast is produced by Jam and Sun. You can listen and follow via the link in the description or by searching Jam and Sun on Instagram.